Well, hello, we're going to get started. My name is Martin Murray, and I'm the representative from Taubman College to introduce Professor Saskia Sassen this evening. And we want to thank the Department of Sociology for their generous co-sponsorship of this event. And I'm going to say first a few general things, then I'm going to tell a story, and then I'm going to talk about ideas. Saskia is the Robert S. Lynn Professor of Sociology at Columbia University. And I think it's a quite interesting choice of a professorship. Robert S. Lynn and his wife Helen wrote two famous books on Muncie, Indiana, called Middletown, in the 1920s or the 1930s. Robert was a professor at Columbia for, I don't know, close to 30 years. He was investigated by the House Un-American Activities Committee in the 1950s for his alleged communist leanings. And the parents are also the father of Stoughton Lind, a famous historian and political activist who I was lucky enough to have met once in my previous earlier life. Saskia was born in the Netherlands, but grew up in Argentina and Italy, studied in France, and was raised in 5 different languages, and began her professional career in the United States. She got her PhD at University of Notre Dame, 1974. She's previously held positions at the University of Chicago, London School of Economics. She's received so many awards and honors that it would be impossible to repeat these, and so I'm going to skip that. But I'm going to tell a story. This evening, when I walked in the door, I ran into Saskia, sort of looking to find her computer that she was unclear where it was in this labyrinth that we call the Art and Architecture building. That same event took place over 40 years ago when I ran into Saskia, when she was also looking for a cab in the same way, and I was looking for a cab in New York City, and we grabbed a cab together to go to some party or some event in New York, and we spent 20 minutes to a half hour having this engaging conversation that I don't remember what the conversation was about, but I remember running into her. Saskia is truly a global intellectual. Her work is theoretically informed and empirically grounded, which is a rare combination, I think, among intellectuals who tend to deviate along one or the other of the extremes. Her writing is clear and concise. Her style of argumentation is informative but not provocative, and her evidence is always tailored to her claims. Over the course of her long and illustrious academic career, she has struggled to make sense of the big, monumental issues of the day. She has always had her eyes on the prize of trying to see and make sense of the biggest and most important questions of the day: migration and uneven demands for labor, cities in the world economy, globalization and its discontents, territory and rights, marginalization and exclusion. In order to make a significant contribution to scholarship, sometimes we academics need merely to draw attention to new questions rather than providing ready-made answers. In short, triggering a debate can be more meaningful sometimes than trying to end a discussion once and for all. Saskia Sassen has actually done both. She has started conversations, but also answered questions that perplexed scholars for some time. Let me read a few sentences from the descriptions of tonight's lecture entitled Predatory Formations Dressed in Wall Street Suits and Algorithmic Math. It is here in this description where she captures the essence of what I consider to be her four main themes or objects of investigation. Assemblages of complex types of knowledge and technologies, including algorithmic mathematics, law and accounting, and high-level logistics, have generated complex predatory formations. The complexity of these formations tends to camouflage their predatory character. Further, such formations are systemic in nature. They are not produced by an elementary seizure of power. Predatory formations are often beyond the reach of ordinary policy responses, in good part because they tend to assemble elements of separate domains into novel configurations. I have distilled, in my view, what are her four main objects of investigation that have carried over the course of her long academic career. First, sort of asymmetric structural patterns that hold the world economy together in evolving tension. These are the enduring and durable features that we face, the kind of iron cage of Max Weber. And these are captured most poignantly in her concept of globalization, which she returns to over and over again. The second is the jagged movement of capital and people that both respond to opportunities made available within these structural constraints. And these are captured in her attention to issues of migration and in the global city with the flows of capital. The third is organizational logics, expressed as assemblages that constitute the active agencies like migration, expulsion, and so forth. And fourth and finally are the scales and territories, entanglements of multiple sovereignties, citizenship, rights, and belonging. And I think it's this sort of combination of these four different dimensions that sort of make up her thought processes over the course of her career. As Saskia argues in the second edition to The Global City, quote, "The globalization of economic activity entails a new type of organizational structure. To capture this theoretically and empirically requires correspondingly a new type of conceptual architecture," unquote. She goes on to argue that in earlier times, the international economic system was ensconced largely in an interstate system, where the key actors were largely nation states. This has changed rather dramatically over this past decade, beginning in the 1970s, 80s, as a result of privatization, deregulation, and digitalization. And the term global city, as Saskia has put it, is an attempt to name a difference. In my view, the global city stresses the functional and organizational patterns, the structures that enable corporate and financial entities to locate command and control operations in specific localities, the so-called global cities, where they orchestrate the far-flung networks of production, exchange, and distribution. This is about understanding the concentration of financial power and the dispersal of production and trade. And I think that for me, what for me this does is that it was part of a wider process, part of a wider intellectual project shared by world systems analysts, by Samir Amin, by Robert Brenner, and many others, to basically displace that characteristic feature that we had inherited from, certainly from the post-World War II period, of seeing nation states as the sort of principal objects of analysis, and shifting that focus to the world economy as the object of analysis. I think reshapes the way in which we begin to think about the world. For example, if we look at a place like when people say, people have told me, for example, when I say I work on Johannesburg, they say, oh, you do international planning or international urban studies. And I say, no, I do global urban studies, and I also work on Detroit, which is part of a global system. Detroit is not local, Johannesburg is not international, both are global and local at the same time. Now, this magical mystery tour of her work has moved from the upper echelons of sanitized power to the seamier, darker side of the global economy. And I'm going to fast forward to her more recent work. Rather than falling into the consoling myth that free markets, profit-seeking investments, and economic growth are sufficiently powerful forces to lift all boats, providing opportunities for the world's poor to find a place in prosperity, Saskia has recently drawn more attention to the growing inequalities, marginalization, and the shredding of life chances on the market as they appear on a global scale. This focus parallels work by Mike Davis in Planet of Slums, or in its smaller pamphlet by Jackie Wang called Carceral Capitalism, and many others. While much has been said about accelerating income inequalities and global unemployment, expanding population of the displaced persons and refugee camps, the prison industrial complex, and the carceral state, and the ever-widening destruction of land and water resources, very little is understood about the causes and the connections between contemporaneous features of precarity. Saskia argues, to quote from the publisher's description of the book, these socioeconomic and environmental dislocations cannot be fully understood in the usual terms of poverty and injustice, unquote. The evolving logic of contemporary expulsion comes in many guises, cloaked in the pieties and the nostrums that seek to distract attention from the sheer brutality of its operations. Again, to borrow from the publisher's description, quote, expulsions lays bare the extent to which the sheer complexity and entangled interests of the global economy makes it difficult to expose the lines of responsibility for the displacement, evictions, and permanent exclusion it produces and reproduces. And equally difficult for those who benefit from the system to locate their own personal responsibility for its predatory practices. The starting point for Saskia's thinking about expulsions and social cleansing is the claim that the breakdown of the Keynesian logic of incorporation that governed the long 20th century takes shape as a switch, quote, switch from the dynamics that brought people in, and this was the whole growth of the modern industrial city, the growth of modern industrial production that was all about loosening people from their ties to the countryside, drawing people into cities to work in the massive manufacturing facilities that produced the outcome of mass commodities like cars in Detroit. And it's this switch from this dynamic into the dynamic today that governs the way the structural governance of the world economy today are those forces that are forcing people out and setting up barriers to maintain their exclusion from the mainstream of urban life. Thank you.
Oh, yes. Well, I'm actually really deeply moved by the depth, the detail that you brought to this just, to me, wonderful introduction. I really want to thank you. That was really, you reminded me of something that I had forgotten. You know how that works with us? Now, it's an enormous pleasure to be here. And I wanted to say I brought this incredibly heavy book for your library or whatever. Book, yeah? Okay. Well, I completely agree, by the way, with everything he said. You got it completely right, and again, I can't thank you enough. And you have a text, right? I might just take it on the road. and use it because it's really a very good summary. Well, you already read this, so I can, let me check this out that I do it right. So you already described quite a bit, so which I will not repeat because you really did, you covered quite a bit. So let me just go into a more analytic element here. This notion of before method. We all require method, you know, in whatever the domains within which we function, within which we develop our thesis and analyses. I have become very interested in the before method, in the sense that I think we, and this is typical, we go through these epochs. So right now we hit a certain kind of epoch, and I want to always exit the epoch I'm in. I don't know if any of you also has this problem, you know, that it's just everybody going in a certain direction. So my before method is a way of moving back and perhaps having a chance to see what is a bit lost if you just function within the paradigm. So I believe in the paradigm, but I'm interested in the edges of the paradigm, where the paradigm gets fuzzy. It's correct, it grabs elements that are there, etc., and then something else is happening. So that is just for those of you who are working on these types of alignments, and having heard your presentation, I assume that there must be quite a few. And the second point here, the question of analytic tactics or a tactical analytics. I think in periods of unsettlement, and unsettlements can be rather invisible in complex systems. They're not immediately self-evident. There is a kind of tactical analytics in play that this is sort of my concept. I'm not sure that everybody agrees with that, by the way, but I like this notion of it, and again, I never think, is it analytic tactics or a tactical analytics? I'm finding myself preferring the second one, a tactical analytics. So tactical means that there's an openness, there is a repositioning that can be part of that whole thing. And when you do that, and you do that with established disciplines, established analyses, etc., you actually begin to see stuff. I really recommend it, at least to some of you. I know many of you are probably architects, or I don't know, but that might not be so comfortable. But now, so here are some of these tactics, right? We need, or I find myself needing, to actively destabilize, in other words, unsettle what are stable meanings. What is the economy today? We have a whole bunch of languages, especially now, I'm speaking, of course, in the social sciences a bit, no? A whole set of languages and categories that have lost their strength. And so this notion of destabilizing stable meanings is not just sort of an act of savagery or whatever, let's unsettle. No, it's that we need to create new meanings. We need to recognize that destabilizing. Same thing in this notion of in the shadow of powerful explanations. The heart of a powerful explanation is strong. I'm more interested in what's happening at the edges, where the paradigm becomes weak. You know, it loses traction. Something else is happening in there. So a lot of my work is based on that, in that edge. And same thing with the notion of shadows, in the shadows of powerful explanations. Now, one subject that has really interested me a lot, I don't know why exactly, is the territorial condition. There is a materiality involved in the territorial. It also contains non-material elements, clearly. But that materiality that is involved in the territorial, that again, I repeat, is a partial materiality, because there are all kinds of other things happening that are not necessarily material, to me is a kind of a point of entry, a way of accessing existing conditions that are not necessarily easy to see, to recognize, or are not mentioned. In other words, a kind of transversality. And the same thing with this notion of when territory exits conventional framings. So when you look at certain kinds of scholarship, on the political system, on international, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, they're caught in settings that are getting unsettled. And so I'm just really interested in cutting through a lot of that stuff. Finally, this question of expulsions. And by expulsions, I often mean something that happens inside a system. I am not speaking about a country, for instance, expelling people. That's also happening. I mean the expulsions that happen in the interiority of a system. By the way, this reminds me, did I already mention it? I mentioned it to you, right? This is a book I brought for you all. It's huge. I consider this huge. It weighs a ton. They almost didn't let me add it to my whatever baggage, but it is, it's truly, well, it's a collective effort, but it's a bit boring, of course, you know, academic books, but it might be, it has a lot of data, so I just leave that here for, you will decide for the whatever, the school. Now, the question of the global city, just to put a few elements here. So when I am trying to do an analytics of the global city, this is the core element, that the global city is an extreme intermediation function. Now, I'm actually very curious, is the term intermediation, does that mean anything? I know you know the word, but intermediation, you know, it's something that is an in-between. Huh? So to me, this is an important concept in the current condition. So again, as I say there, in its tightest formulation, the notion of the global city is an extreme intermediation function. In other words, the global city is not something that is autonomous. It's not something that just is there because it has power. It is absolutely intermediating with all kinds of other worlds. And so, and the global city should here be understood in a somewhat abstract way. It's not sort of the globality, oh, we have a lot of international whatevers. It's a bit more complicated than that. Point number 4. There is no such entity as a single global city. It is a multi-sided networked system of global cities. Now, what I have found very interesting in my research and sort of fun was to connect what are the networks that get. So if you look at New York, London, they're more connected to Hong Kong. You know, these are particular activities, particular networks. And so when you look at it, you see that Hong Kong is very strong. For Chicago, it's Shanghai. And also, you know, a few other places, but I'm just mentioning this. So this notion of transversalities that are not necessarily captured, you know, in the typical daily conversation or in the news, but they are markers of a new epoch, an epoch that begins really 20, 30 years ago, but it's not necessarily visible. And this is another issue, you know, epochal transformations are not necessarily self-evident. They don't tell you, here I am. I'm new. They don't. And you discover them in bits and pieces because I'm speaking about complex and messy and often open systems. You know, when you deal with open systems, you always get a lot of messiness. So what I want to focus on a bit now, just to add some elements to the discussion, are these 2 key features of today's Western economies. One is the question of intermediation, which is a term that not everybody is working with, but some of you may be familiar. And the other one is the capacity of finance, of high finance, which is algorithmic math. It has nothing to do with traditional banking. Zero. I mean, absolutely zero. So by algorithmic math, extraordinary transformations can be executed. They're not necessarily visible, but operationally speaking, they're a profound transformation. And so one way of capturing maybe the extreme instance is high finance, which is mostly algorithmic math. So that also means, just this is a little side note, that microeconomics, which is a very complex science, is zero helpful when you're dealing with algorithmic math. Now, I want to repeat, microeconomics is one of the most complex and accomplished systems. It's enclosed in its own thing. It's mostly academics, you know, and they can then develop icons of. But that's not where the real stuff is happening in my reading. It may have, a few decades ago, but so to me that is also sort of a, So, and what I will be talking about besides intermediation is this notion of the financializing. What all is getting financialized? And again, it's algorithmic math, it's not just sort of average business. Now, I want to start, and I can walk here, right? Right. So, I want you to look at this curve. So this is 201, and that's 919 billion. This is just one instrument that accounts at this point for 10% of what is the financial system in play. And then, a few years later, like 10 years later, it's 62 trillion. Now, I don't know if you have a sense of what 62 trillion is. It's a hell of a lot. It really is. And you can see an extremely sharp curve. So I don't want to elaborate too much on this. And this, I repeat, is just 10% of what is happening in this financial mode in that period. And it's just a datum. So it represents the value that it represents is much more than the global GDP of all the countries in the world. So we know this is not money. Money doesn't get there. We use money as a measure, but something else is happening there. And so one of the issues that I want to develop a bit is what is developing there is a kind of capture of all kinds of things, that via algorithmic math and all these extraordinarily complex instrumentalities that exist today, you can transform it into valuations of all kinds. Now, I will develop this a bit more because I know it's a bit abstract. Second element that I want to sort of point out that is deeply in play, and this is actually, this has just only grown. I just realized that I don't have the new slide here. I have a new slide. So, dark pools in finance. That is not my language. That was the language of the head of the central bank of the United States. When have you heard a central banker speak about dark pools in finance? And this was this very distinguished, academic who came from Princeton University, etc. He was really a very serious scholar. And he puts out this language. What we're dealing with are dark pools in finance. And there, what you see there is the dark ones is in the United States. I will elaborate on it in a second. And the gray ones is Europe. Now, what are these? These are networks, private networks. You have zero access to them if you are not in them. Now, of course, there is a movement of moving in, but so some of you might actually be moving into some of those, and you might or might not know that that's happening to your money. But so these are completely private, completely closed. Most of the financial transactions are happening there. They are not happening on the familiar, stock market and all of that. They're not happening there. They also then use those, and so this is a whole world that is very active in Europe, but especially also in the United States, etc. That we cannot see it, we cannot enter it, and in fact, that is what I wanted to come back to. When the head of the Fed, you know what I mean by the Fed, right? When the head of the Fed retires, a distinguished professor from Princeton University, what he was saying is, I may be the head of the Federal Reserve, but I don't know what the hell is happening. All I know is that you have all these privatized pools where all the money transactions are happening, where the wealth, in quotation marks, is being created. That, I don't know, I realize I'm talking to an audience that is mostly architecture, etc., but that is not the typical way in which the head of a central bank is describing what is happening. And again, he was a very conventional person. So this is just, I'm just hoping that you are getting something out of that. The extent to which even the leading authorities, which used to be centers of power, can no longer fully command some of these economic operations. Now, totally different element, totally different, but important in what it shows. So I want you to look at that, the title, because the way the language is deployed is also something. So, ratio of household credit to personal disposable income. Credit sounds really nice. Credit, I get something. It's debt. So already there you notice the language, instead of saying debt, credit. Now, the United States, queen of the domain when it comes to credit, it's a very particular period, by the way, because I'm really interested in when Western Europe, Eastern Europe enters our sort of Western sphere. So, but the United States, just as a little side point, is already over 104%, 100 is the total, and by then it is 132. Now back to the entities up there. Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, etc. Just especially those are interesting. So now you know the story of Hungary. At some point they all joined the West, and it takes a bit of time, etc. That's sort of in the middle period of that process. So Czech Republic, in 2000, 8.5% is household debt. Remember that credit is debt. Yeah? And 5 years later, it's 27%. Hungary, 11% household debt, and almost 40% up. Now, to get that kind of transformation, something is happening. This doesn't fall from the sky. In other words, there are actors which might have been Swiss. In this case, I know that what I'm describing here is mostly Swiss, German, and Viennese financial firms. There are all these microcosms in here. And they were interested in capturing those emergent markets that were basically poor countries. You understand that those countries at that time are very, very poor. And so you can see, you can just, what I want to emphasize is look at the growth from 8.5% to 27% domestic debt, household debt, and the second, Hungary, 11 to 39. Somebody is selling those households, those modest households, money. Now here we enter two elements. So one thing is the firm, whatever, says, yeah, you can do that. You sign here and you're fine, and you do. And the other question is, why? Why were some of these financial firms, Swiss firms, German firms, Viennese firms, why were they interested in that? And I will come back to this a bit later, but basically, there is one element in the financial system that needs to somehow construct a bridge with actors, no matter how modest they are. They need that now. It's impossible to describe that. But in other words, modest households play a role in high finance, a role that we cannot see. But that explains partly the pushing of you can buy this, you can do this, etc. Some of the stuff that I'm describing there winds up with many of those modest households losing just about everything. But the financiers who were involved, they got what they wanted. Oops, I have to go here now, right? And here is some other stuff I'm just going to. The main point that I'm trying to make in this first element is that extractive sectors, and high finance is an extractive sector. It's not just mining that is extractive. Extractive sectors can extract even from modest households. How do they do that? Credit. Credit sounds good, right? It sounds credit, nice, I get it. No, credit means that you have a debt. So debt functions as a certain kind of instrument in all of this. Now here is yet another extractive mode that I want to focus on. And this is something that you all have heard about, which is when the mortgage crisis in the United States, I'm sure that some of you know about it, right? So when there were like 10 years where a certain type of mortgage, where people were told, you can own a house, you don't have to pay anything, just sign. And 14.5 million households in the United States signed. Now, for a very, very, very few, it worked out. For most, it did not. They lost everything. And sidestepping another sort of set of elements, the crisis ends, as you know, with basically 14.5 million households being expelled, you know, they lost everything. 14.5 million households can be up to 30 million people. We could not see that. Again, the extent to which certain material conditions are not visible to us. So that, because why it went over 8 years at least, so most of it was maybe 4 or 5 years. So this is crisis happening in a huge country like the United States. And again, you know, 14.5 million households lose everything, and we couldn't see it with our eyes. You know, this is sort of, to me, an important point. The complexities that are happening, that moreover are destructive, are dramatic, and we cannot see it, partly because it's a huge country and partly because of the time frame of 8 to 9 years. You know, that's a big framework. Now, one of the issues in play, which has not been quite, I would argue, understood in the general media and the analysis about all of this, is this notion of, you know, that modest neighborhoods become part of global finance. And the modest neighborhood is just another world, a visual world that has nothing to do with global finance. So that it's understandable, you know, that it's somehow, people couldn't quite get it. It took a lot of brilliant instruments to achieve that. You know, this was not just grabbing or stealing. This is highly intermediated with incredibly fancy stuff. Like I like to say, when you walk into Goldman Sachs, has anybody been there lately? In one of the Goldman Sachs? So where you before had 100 secretaries sitting at these, yeah? Now you have, guess what? What do you think? Who are the 100 who are sitting there now? Physicists. So this is not economics. This is something else, as I said at the start. This is a brilliant set of instruments. Algorithmic math, you know, it's an open system. So 5-year-olds can also create a little algorithm, right? You just put 1 and 2, you don't even need closure. Imagine, you know, with brilliant physicists. So when you walk, I repeat, into Goldman Sachs, you would see all kinds of physicists. And that it holds, that's just one dramatic example, but it holds for many others. Now, so the making of instruments that enable the use of modest elements. So this is actually, there is a lot of brilliance and intelligence in designing these instruments, which are based on very modest elements, but making it extractive, and hence you can concentrate the wealth, etc. And then comes the whole story of the mortgages. I don't want to go into that detail. I just want to move on. Now, here are some of these examples. For those of you who might not have seen it, I'm sure that many of you have. The tragedy of these millions of households losing everything. And this is a very short, dramatic, brutal history. So we're talking millions. So I repeat what I already said. The other thing for me that struck me, you know, the whatever in me, is such a dramatic event that involved people, bodies, physicalities. We can't see it. We couldn't see it. Partly, I repeat, because it took years, partly because it's a huge country, etc., etc. So you have a very material drama involving millions, and we don't see it. And that to me is an invitation to revisit materialities of all sorts, not just as in, you know, an instrumentality, but the material world. So here you have some of these numbers, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it was absolutely a disaster. And of course, if you're talking about 14.5 million households, you're talking about 30 million people? How is it possible that we didn't see it? I mean, if you were in certain neighborhoods, you knew that it was happening. But, you know, this is a huge country, et cetera. And it has also entered Europe. And I'm sorry, this actually goes on. But the numbers are much smaller. But the instrument is brilliant and effective. And the housing question is forever something that we feel close enough that we say, well, why shouldn't we give it a try? So also in Europe, you have had, sort of, it's a less visible story than in the United States. Now, so one outcome of what I just described is one way of thinking about it is the emptying of urban land. And I think that is an important sort of effect or outcome. That may not have been the intention, but I do think it matters. And one element that comes out of that is access to urban land, which you can have now in certain situations because of all of these disasters, which before you didn't, because there were little houses occupied by people and you couldn't just go down and... So there are these overlapping histories, an old history that is dying, a new history that emerges. Now here are, this is something else, but to me very, very interesting, which is the buying of urban land, which can also be the buying of buildings, but urban, in major cities. Now, I have a list of 100, the 100 top cities, so this is just one. This is 2013 is when it starts. So these are, you can see very extreme, in New York, London, etc. By now, and this goes on, I have a list of 100. By now, what you have is a whole set of new cities because they have done New York, they have done London. There's only so much that this extractive sector, you know what I'm calling it, which is really high finance, wants. They don't want everything, they just want certain things. And they get those things. So they've done New York, they've done London, they've done Tokyo, they've done LA, etc. So now I'm beginning to look what, you know, and again, the list goes on, you know, what else? The numbers are always quite significant. There is an amazing amount of money in circulation in our world. And I think that is a whole other subject. Are we talking money as we know it? No, we're not talking that kind of money. This is another kind of money. Now here these are just foreign investments, so this is a different story. Now just to give you a sort of a concrete little element, in the case of London, for instance, as you know, the Queen of England owns quite a reasonable amount of land in central London, but so do the Qatari royals. They own more of central London than the Queen of England, which I find actually positively enchanting almost, you know. They're both problematic actors also, but anyhow, so the stuff that is happening, and again, we don't see it. So I go sometimes, you know, I have to go with, I try to avoid it. I live quite a bit in London. Some journalist says, okay, let's go walk through all these areas, you know, in central London where you're writing about it, etc. And these are areas where I really don't go much because it's so crowded with tourists. But the first time I did one of these, I heard somebody say, look at all these beautiful British buildings. And I knew all those buildings. None of them was owned by a British firm. Now, London is pretty extreme in this, and I don't have anything against that, but it's sort of funny, again, what the material is not enabling us to see. You know, we think of the material, a table is a table. And anyhow, so let me move this on. So here are some of these. There is an evolution involved in these. Here are some particular cities that I focus on. And, you know, there definitely is a curve in the sense that they buy, and then they're done with a particular city. There might be a few others that then enter and buy, but it's really very selective buying. This is not simply grabbing. I just wanted to, I don't know that this helps you see that element there. But for instance, this is a better example. So Berlin, the minus 6.2%, you know, a loss, but look how big the quantity is. So they start, the buying starts, you know, by these very particular actors. They start buying, and then they're done. So they're done with Berlin. They're done with Frankfurt almost. So, Hamburg. I just selected these 4 major cities in Germany. So, Hamburg higher. Because they've done the other one. So it's very selective, and that again adds to a kind of invisibility. You can't see it because it's not like, wow, you know, they grab it. No, very selective grabbing. Now, so one way of sort of talking a bit about it is when materiality, the material, loses its capacity to be speech. And this is something that really interests me. You know, you understand I'm using speech in this sort of this abstract version. One simple example, when a building is no longer for people, but for making asset-backed financial instruments. Okay, I didn't really develop this thing. So in London, in Manhattan, some of you must have been maybe recently in Manhattan, you will see some very fancy towers that are empty. And the notion is, so the commentary or whatever, you know, something is not working economically, they built this big building and now nobody's using it. Well, I already alluded to it earlier. Well, yes and no. In some cases it might be that. But what we are also seeing is that one empty luxury tower, not one, I mean empty, and empty luxury tower might actually be more profitable than an occupied luxury tower. You can see why, right? If that tower is functioning in the mode of asset-backed securities, which are the high, you know, derivatives are for you and me. You want to avoid them, by the way. They are dead. But asset-backed securities is the, you know, that empty tower is less trouble than an occupied trouble. People are trouble. So now we see in Manhattan, we have a few empty towers. Now, I don't know if all of them are actually delivering the goods, but quite a few of them, I know, they have become part of the making of asset-backed securities. You don't need people for that. So again, we need new language. You know, we need to understand how do we begin to see, because we can't see it with our eyes, so we have to see it, you know, with forms of knowledge, etc. What the hell is happening? Now, did I? Okay, yeah, right. So here this is my story that I just described, you know, that this journalist asked me to go with him. And so we were walking in the middle there, and the tourists saying, oh, look at all these beautiful British blah, blahs. And of course, I had the data on these buildings. These are all foreign-owned buildings. Now, I am not against the foreign, because in fact, some of them may be Brits that are going through, you know. But it's this notion, the notion that the material is not quite telling us the full story, that we assume we understand what we're seeing. Okay, I'm going to skip this. Now, these top 100 cities that are sort of the queens of the domain, they account for 10% of the world's population, which in some sense one would say that's quite a bit because the world's population after all, but 30% of the world's GDP, 76% of property investment, and that's of course a basic thing. Now, this is data from civils who know how to handle it. They are in the business of selling, and renting out, etc. They are everywhere. I was in Phnom Penh, and I was looking for some data sources, and there was civils, which really surprised me. So worldwide real estate assets are nearly 60% of the value of all global assets. I don't know if this means anything to you, but that's a very extreme condition. And this includes equities, bonds, and gold. Do you understand what this says? This says that the valuations that we're seeing of buildings are huge. And there is no way of explaining it. We're just saying, oh, we need housing or we need office space. This is something else in play. And it is really the utilizing of that material good to produce other kinds of instruments where the real story plays out. Now, this is back to more normal stuff. So these are London properties purchased by overseas companies between 2005 and 2014. And it's a lot of them. And we don't have the information for any one of these as to who owns it. They are all outside actors. They are not local. They don't have a designation that allows you to understand who has bought this building. And in London, I mean, it's big, but still. And then we have sort of the version right here in town, so to say, in Manhattan, these towers that are basically completely underused. And so I'm trying to now to establish to what extent, these are Manhattan, central Manhattan, to what extent they are simply functioning as assets. So you don't want people in there. People are a mess. People are, they make demands, et cetera, et cetera. I'm trying to really sort that out. I'm not completely there. No, it's sort of one way of thinking about some of this stuff, which is very partial element in our current condition, but it's a very significant also actor, is are we dealing with a kind of new systemics that we need to develop, that we need to understand what are we seeing? Because a house or a building is no longer only, I mean, mostly they are, but there are these exceptions, it's no longer simply, a building. It's something else. It looks like a building, but so one way of thinking about it is that we are sort of confronting a logic of extraction, even where you do not expect it, where you assume, how can modest houses, for instance, be, part of this domain? So here is a bit more of this stuff, etc. Now, in rural areas, we have another set of issues that I'm not going to talk about, but I want to sort of conclude with this notion of, that one way of thinking about the current period, and everything is temporary, nothing lasts forever, is that this language here, at its most extreme, we see two rising urban formats. And one of them, one image is this. In other words, this actually, the lower part is Mexico, the Mexico, sort of a part of Mexico. The upper part is just a juxtaposition of towers that exist, but it's not all in one place. I want to alert you because people always ask me, where is it? Where can I see this? Actually, you can't. This is real. The top is bringing together a lot of tall luxury buildings that come, that are in different cities. But, the United States is a huge empty country. You know this, right? I mean, a lot of space. Many parts of the world are very crowded. You also know that. So I do think that this may emerge as one of the formats of our immediate future. This is not a completely unreasonable space. You understand, these are very modest houses. I grew up in Latin America, so we had a lot of that. And, many of the people who are there, they're sort of fine. They're poor, they're struggling, it's not easy, but it's not, there are far more degraded areas. But this juxtaposition, again, this is a photographer put these two together. That is it's those big towers, etc. That is really well, one way, again, I repeat myself, really. These are two major formats. We don't see them in Canada or in the United States, but we see them in many parts of the world. And when there is not enough land in some areas, as you know, it's floating on water. These are whole new, this is in Asia clearly, whole new worlds where the only way to have housing is on water. I just want to finish with this one sort of little item here, that this bimodal urban development, which has many, many different phases, many different modalities, does increase the distance between the rich and the poor. And if you think of a city like Manhattan or Chicago, there was a time, this goes back quite a few decades, when the rich and the modest middle classes, which is most often the majority of the population in a city, they weren't that separate. Now you have a much stronger separation. And in that sense, I sort of like this image of our frontier, the frontier in our world, in our period, is actually in cities. That is where the frontier is emerging. It's not at the edges of empire as it was at a time. And this to me is sort of a notion that is a provocation. How do we think about this? What are the categories of analyses that we're running to and that we need to develop, etc. And so this change, in a way, really matters. This new way of thinking about it, it diminishes the long history of cities. It takes out a lot of positives. And it also engages the question of open spaces, in a different way. But I want to leave you with I want to leave you with this. So I think that is sort of what I wanted to share with you. And I'm just going to leave it at that. And maybe you have some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Saskia, and we really appreciate how thoughtful you've been in your work and also listening to, talking to PhD students today and really talking to them about their interests.
Did I mention that this book is for you all? You don't have to read it, okay? This is like a phenomenally heavy book, but it's very good. And I like the notion that it's on the Arctic, but of course, the Arctic is just one part of the book. But anyhow, I don't know how we handle this, but you will, yes.
Okay, so for the question and answer portion, we're going to have some fun. There's a cube there that you can throw, and I think it's pretty soft. So does anyone have a question? And Taru there will throw the cube at them.
Just walk down and then throw. There you go. Okay, so I was wondering, Saskia, if you could
Where
explain...
are you?
I'm here.
Ah.
If you could explain or talk a little bit more about your phrase, when materiality loses its capacity to be speech, right? Because it comes from the... In a way, it makes me question whether materiality had a capacity to be speech in a very neutral or direct way, anyway, in any point in history. Or like what makes this a new phenomenon for you?
Well, because your eyes, in some of these extreme, remember that what I presented were extreme cases, extreme situations, right? So it's not like most of Manhattan has these tall towers, So we're talking about a very particular component in major cities, especially major cities. But it seems to me that that there is something that has changed, that the materiality of it is becoming increasingly more partial, a partial element in understanding what you are seeing. Whereas there was a time, when a house was a house. You know, and a firm, whatever it was a firm. Well, today we don't, I don't know, I did show you, right, those 65,000 entities in, did I show it or not? Yeah, it was on the thing, right? 65,000 buildings that are owned in London that nobody knows who the owners is, we don't know their, you know, those are extreme conditions. Cities have always had a few empty buildings that they needed to fill, but this is a different modality. And so it just brings up all kinds of issues about how does the urban get shaped nowadays in these rather, again, I repeat, these are extreme conditions that I'm looking at. It's in major cities. It's expanding, but it's in major cities. It also entails a kind of algorithmic mathematical capacity to transform a building or a truck or whatever into an asset. Yeah? That's a very special capability that we have now because of algorithmic mathematics. So I repeat, these are extreme conditions, and one way of thinking about them, besides their complexities and all of that, is what they keep from us visually. There is stuff there that we think we're seeing it, but we're really not. Like I think I mentioned, right, that when you walk into Goldman Sachs, the office, by the way, you have to knock on the door. It's not like you can simply walk in. It's not like a shopping mall. You have all these physicists, where before there were secretaries. That's a big shift. That tells a whole story. Huh? I mean, I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this. But that tells you that something very foundational has changed about finance. And again, what interests me is how much of that can we actually see? You know, our eyes. What are our eyes nowadays seeing less and less of? Now, you are all visual. I mean, the School of Architecture and I don't know what the other mix is here.
Urban planning.
But there's a lot of visual stuff, right? Well, I'm just telling you a tale. Watch out, you know? Look twice, so to speak. But anyhow.
Okay, well, thank you, Sassen, so much for this. And I want to ask you, how do you kind of comprehend that, in addition to the figures that you presented,
Yeah.
when you read about globalization, there are also some real claims that, for example, this has been the best 20 years or 30 years in human history.
For some, maybe.
Well, you know, in other words, that
Right.
the incident, you know, the number of people living in extreme poverty has dropped by billions in a way that simply has never happened.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is, you know, do you see this as a reality, and is it possible that some of the things you're describing are necessary to create
those are
this
two very
change?
Separate. That's a good point, the second one. Well, listen, I think we still have, as we all know, a hell of a lot of people who are on the losing side, right? Including that when I talked about the mortgages, those, I mean, millions that lost everything, right? So we know that this is a highly imperfect world. Now, what you were asking also about the new generations, right? A new or not? You had something else in there.
I was asking, is it possible?
Yeah.
In other words, if you credit the basic statistics, and I think we have to, about you know, income growth for literally billions of people, is it possible that the system you're describing is the one that's producing this?
It's less productive.
What?
Less, okay. Yeah. You know, listen, I have focused on very extreme conditions here. Extreme cities, extreme, right? So I think a majority of the urban condition is probably a bit more normal and more reasonable than what I described. And including a city like Manhattan, you know, I'm talking about a few buildings that are in play. These empty towers that are now being transformed into instrumentality, so they're fine with these empty towers. But those are very extreme conditions. So I think basically in cities, this is not a bad epoch for cities. Partly because you have a whole new young generation which also doesn't care about cars too much. You know, there are, when I'm thinking about New York and I'm thinking of some European cities, this is not a bad time for cities. That does not preclude some of the stuff that I was describing, right, which is the stuff that you are less likely to notice because it's extreme and it's not as visible. Huh? So I just want to leave, and so I thank you for your comment or your question, that I think there's a lot of good stuff happening in cities, and the new generations are more into walking and, you know, not having cars everywhere, though the United States certainly likes cars still a hell of a lot, right? Yeah. So it's not bad. Again, what I described are extreme elements that we should also be aware of, you know, because my question, of course, is what's next? Now, I just want to ask you a question. Who knows about Schwarzman? Schwarzman? He's the buyer of all this. I mentioned him, I think, in passing. He's one of the major buyers of housing, modest, just to give you a very concrete example, modest housing for modest people. And he goes to this, he has been operating in 17 countries. He's also he is a top financier. Right? And he has managed to expel hundreds of thousands of people from their very modest sort of, we're talking basically towers and not just little houses, saying we're going to upgrade. In 17 countries he has done this. We're going to upgrade, and then you can come back and it will be better. Well, yes and no. So there are two things. Yes, he upgrades, but he also, the price rises, so it has created its own drama. But the other thing that is happening is he takes control over these towers, and then they work for him, who is a financier, as he can build asset-backed securities. Because that is the irony that I was trying to convey. I don't know that I did, but that there is a lot of very advanced high finance which actually needs the material. Now, they're capable of transforming this table into some abstract part of an instrument. It would take many, many tables to reach a certain. But so that is where this algorithmic mathematical capability is just like a whole new actor. I mean, mind you, it's been around in this mode for 10 years at least. Huh? But that's a whole new, how do you say it in gameplay or whatever? That's an expression that you have? Game? What? Okay, game, whatever, game. You know, well, yeah, I just said, I hope that, did I more or less answer your question or not? I sort of, but I know, by the way, people, that a lot of this stuff must have been a bit, what is she talking about? But I think if you heard, you know, if you listened, that you will see, you will begin to notice, you will see instances, especially in a big city, you will understand that empty tower is not luxury tower. We're talking luxury tower. I showed you those 3 luxury towers, right? Yeah. That empty tower is not necessarily a loss, because many people, they see that and they think, ooh, nope. And now here then the issue is interesting to me, and I don't know how long this will last, because I have the sense that the need for the material to produce some of these options. I'm talking high finance. You know, that is quite interesting. Why do they need something material? Nor do I know how long that will last. But right now, there is a need for the material. So what I didn't talk about, for instance, is what happens in in the markets, where you have all kinds of entities sort of buying and selling. And so one thing that is in play, of course, is buying and selling of all kinds of materialities, from food to housing. And that is a thriving operation, and that happens in many countries. Huh? And but it's not, you think that you know what you're seeing, but you're not. You don't know what you're seeing, because you don't know what the transformative effect is. So you think, aha, this is a house or a building. A building is a building. Well, a building can function in many different ways. So, and in that sense, this is really an invitation to, on the one hand, as I said, to recover our understanding of the material. What are we really talking about, when we're dealing with a materiality? And on the other hand is, how do we begin to enter these other modes, which are really different? This is new stuff. Now, this algorithmic math, as you know, a 5-year-old, I think I mentioned at the start, a 5-year-old can also build an algorithm. Open systems, it doesn't have to have perfect closure. So my fantasy is that we actually develop like a natural capacity to work with algorithms, with very simple algorithms, but that at the same time a new kind of knowledge becomes part of daily life, which is not an uninteresting, because there is a knowledge function in play in that. And so that you're like a salesman of whatever, potatoes, why should they not also understand that principle, right? It's such a, this is taking me to another zone, so I'm going to stop talking about that, the potato and all of that. But you understand what I'm saying or not? In other words, these are complex instruments, they're open instruments, they're not closed. So we should really be able to, and I'm sure many of you already do it, you may not have the same designations that I use, but okay, I really appreciate you all sitting through this, because I know that it is not necessarily that close to your subject. And probably, I only can hope that it was clear, that I left something here with you all. Yes? Okay. Shall we? I don't know if there are more questions, but I understand the subject is a bit remote, probably. Huh? Yeah.
See, I think we have a question over there.
This is kind of a bizarre question, but
bizarre is good. Yeah.
Since you lobbed at us that some of us could be people who think visually,
who think visually, right.
And you're asking us to rethink what we can see and what we can't see. I'd ask you if there are artists who you think are helping to make some of what you're talking about visible. And one that came to mind for me, and if people have phones, search mural Goldman Sachs, New York. You'll see an enormous painting by Julie Moretu. And you can't go in there and see it, but you can look at it through the plate glass in the front of the building.
Right.
Or you can see it on your phone if you search that. And what do you think? Is that making things visible, or is it a smokescreen? And would there be other artists you'd point us to?
Well, that's a good question. It depends. It really depends who you are too. You understand that you will see certain elements that if you have an algorithmic math expert next to you, a physicist, will see something else. So one of the issues what you're capturing also is this thing that I have mentioned en passant, that the language, we lack language a bit. We are seeing elements, we don't know that we're seeing them, because they lack presence. There is for me, there is an engagement with, so it's not only the whole, the revolution of the whatever, the new technologies. It's that other side, which is what do we see? right? So it is not simply the instrument. There are other, I mean, it gets me into a different zone. But we lack speech, number one. We need to develop new categories of analysis. We need to develop new concepts. We need new names for some of this stuff, right? And so there is work to be done where we are going to be critical actors. We can, and this is happening, we can generate certain namings that are powerful and effective, and we can also generate meanings that are just playing to power, so, which is a negative in this case. So there is what I see is an emergent set of conditions that we have not fully, engaged with, that maybe we think that are the instruments with which we work. They could be conceptual. I'm not just talking about material instruments. That we haven't quite taken it to the next step. The work of naming new conditions, new possibilities, new capabilities. There is a bit of that. There is a bit of that going, but it often flattens. It's the familiar. It's a familiar designation rather than altering the way we name it. Now, across our histories, we have done that with all kinds of minoritized people, very negative formations, etc. But there is, it seems to me that either we have delegated too much to the super experts, or we simply were passive. We are sort of passive. There's a kind of passivity. Maybe it comes from some transformation that is happening. I don't know either. I mean, what do I know? These are big questions. But this is a sort of a comment. So I thank you for the question. That this is part of the story for me. That we lack language. Now, you all know, certainly in this type of university, that there are all new terms that are getting coined, right, to capture some of this. And so I find myself often finding that some things lack a name. We don't have a name for it. And to me, that is an interesting moment, because how we name it, if power names it, they know what they're doing. And we may lose understanding that we should not be losing. That, that it's like a lot of things are in play. Now, when I talk about an emergent condition, this has been going on for 20 years, okay? But it's still going on. I think we have entered a new epoch. And here the big question is, and we know that from history, that major transformations are not always visible. You have major transformations that took 2 decades. And hence you don't really see it. You live with it, but you don't see it. And so there's a lot of that stuff. Now the new technologies are their own world, and that's the most powerful transformative element that we have. It's not the only one, because we also have these other things. Yeah.
At one point you had a bullet point that you sort of skipped over, I thought, for me, too quickly, and it was that the profit that's made on housing is not in the conventional sense. So in the conventional sense of mortgage lending is that a bank will lend money to a homeowner who will then pay a 7%, 10% mortgage over the course of 25 years, and that's the source of profit for the mortgage lender.
Right. Yeah.
But you're suggesting that that's not the source of profit. So could you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I mean, here there are many elements in play, but so we have the traditional mode, the familiar mode, that is also going on, and probably in most cities of the world that is going on. We also have another mode, and that other mode is not about housing. It looks buildings, housing, but something else. And there comes this question of algorithmic mathematics that transforms a tower, a luxury tower, can function as a luxury tower, but can also be something that is, how to put it, that is incorporated into a financializing of that asset or those assets, right? And that is where your average human, we cannot see it. And so one of my emphases was what we cannot see, even though these are major events. When a big so we see a luxury building. Again, just to make a very simple example. We see a luxury building that is empty. And that's empty there for a whole year. The immediate understanding that our brains gives us is, oops, something went wrong. That building should not be empty. It should be occupied by people. The owners must be losing. And that is, I mean, that is one example. That is what we don't know. Because it might be functioning as assets. So what we see as a building can be transformed into a set of assets. And so when Schwarzman, you know Schwarzman, I mentioned him, right? I don't know. Check him out. So when Schwarzman gets these big buildings, you know, of low-income people, he's not into helping low-income people. You know, he has there are at least two elements, there might be others that I don't know about. He has at least two elements that potentially shape what he wants to do. One of them is, okay, let me upgrade this building, the familiar. Let me upgrade this building, and I get rid of the people who are in here, and lower, slightly better, less lower income people can move in, they have to pay more. He has done this in 17 countries, as I said, in a large number of buildings. And in some countries, like in Barcelona, they fought back. In Berlin, they fought back. You know, but in most countries, I mean, the local governments can't quite understand what the hell is happening, etc. Now, so that is one kind of element, right? That what we see is only part of the story, whereas 30 years ago, that would be the story, right? The building, etc., etc. What we don't know, and what is difficult to know is what are the other options for using that building. So again, for me, the dramatic issue is, and this is the case in Manhattan, but not only, also in other places, not just in Manhattan, empty building, empty luxury building. It can't be right? Something went wrong. And so I've tried to understand, did something really go wrong? Or is it actually, Jesus Christ, we don't have to deal with humans here, you know, who mess it up, who are complaints. Now, this is not easy to totally show bit by bit. But we know that this is an option. Did I mention to you people no, I think I mentioned it earlier in the day, maybe, these truckers in the Midwest, Goldman Sachs story. This is in the public domain, because there are many stories that I know that are not in the public domain, but this one is in the public domain. But you know what I'm talking about, right? But so here we are in the field. Why we were there, this was in the middle of the United States. Why, how, don't matter. But we didn't belong there, let me say that. Here are these truckers moving huge metal sheets, like every 2 days or something like that. And so I always play dumb, in those situations. I play stupid. Stupid, older, whatever. You know. Wow, these metal sheets. You know? And the trucker says, well, I'm shorting along. I say, well, we don't know what we're doing, but we just have to move them from one place to the next. Now, I knew the reason that Goldman Sachs was the master of the domain, more or less. You know, they were the ones that were asking these people to move it around. And, well, eventually, to make a this became a public case, and Goldman Sachs had to pay almost $6 billion, which for them is nothing. But they could also have been taken to jail, which would have been much wiser, you know, in a way, take them to jail. But that doesn't work that way, that world. So the question then is, what was happening there? Well, Goldman Sachs had, number one, gathered all the big, these are very particular metals for high-level construction, etc. They had sort of gained control over all of this, what was available. And there was a scarcity, hence, because they were hoarding it. Why were they hoarding it? First, since they owned it, hoarding it meant, and given the demand, hoarding meant prices go up. So they made a pile of money by creating a crisis that was a fictive crisis, that these metal sheets that are very important for construction were in scarce demand. Now, it went, they have done a lot of this. So I want to emphasize two things. One of them is they actually built a whole operation with truckers to move these huge metal sheets around. Because by moving them around, that enabled them to create this sense of that they were not available. Oh, it's gone. It's no, you just stand back and you say, what is this? And that's just one of these operations. Now, Goldman Sachs has brilliant people, brilliant physicists, and then they produce these instruments that, well, I think I more or less said it. I can keep on talking, but anyhow, this became one of the times that it went public, and they were fined, as I said. They could have gone to jail, or whatever, the equivalent of jail. And in this case, they just paid almost $6 billion in penalty. What they were doing was delaying delivery to create a crisis, a sense that, oh my God, we're running out of metal sheets. And this is very significant, material. And hence the prices zoomed up and they made a pile of money because they created an artificial scarcity. And this is not the first time that they do it. Because there was a first time people picked up on this, etc., was like 20 years ago. So you understand the notion, right? The amazing thing is that they produced a huge fictive operations, but that was material. They had to build huge, storage spaces. They were truckers, and you stand back and you say, but my God, it feels like kindergarten, but at a higher level. It's just unbelievable. Do you understand why it's unbelievable or not? Why it's just, you say, my God, this is just to gain more profits, as if they needed that more. And so this is, now the Goldman Sachs has had quite a few of these. They have been very active in this, I don't know what to call it, innovative extraction, I don't know what to call it really. But yeah, so that is part of that story. But in other words, what I also am dealing with, and when I talked about some of the other things, is that we are losing capacity to understand. And the other way of looking at it, which I like more, is that the material is not quite as transparent as we might think or as what we're used to. And that notion of the material losing capacity of speech, that's the image that I like to use, to me is sort of an interesting point, and it's something that one could begin to generate a more complex narrative out of that, something. Okay. I think we're done. How is that?
Okay. Well, thank you again, Saskia. And tomorrow morning we'll start at 8:30 with it's the interlogium or something. But there will be some entertainment and some food, so come early.
Okay, very good. And here is this nice book.